Ironside will not be seen tonight, so we may bring you the following special program.
I was such a fan of the Legion of Superheroes when I was a kid that I always wanted to work with this version of the characters that was designed back in the 1970s. They all had kind of sexier looking costumes that provided almost bikini-like effects for a lot of the characters, both for the men and the women. And there was a sense of the liberation of the age in the 70s. Long hair came into vogue, and there was a lot of feathered hair in some of the cases for the women, and it was designed by one of my favorite costume designers, the legendary Dave Cockrum, who designed the modern X-Men as well as the original Guardians of the Galaxy. And he did this first. He gave all these redesigns to every character. So when I got to create this single painting, I had no gig that had demanded it. It wasn't a deal I had made with anybody, so I started on the piece of art, worked on it for off and on through a year, pitched it to get it made into a print, which it luckily got accepted because it otherwise is a version of the characters that was no longer standing. This was sort of my love letter to the artists that defined that era and characters that really impacted me when I was a young child.
Word Balloon is brought to you by the League of Word Balloon Listeners. Hi, everybody. Welcome back. It's time again for another episode of Word Balloon Live, the comic book conversation show. John Suntress here. I'm happy to welcome Brett Dakin to Word Balloon. Thank you for joining me today, Brett.
Hi, John. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Well, we're going to talk today about your great uncle, I suppose, the great Lev Gleason, and your new book. Amazing book, man. American Daredevil, Comics Communism, and the Battles of Lev Gleason, written by Brett Dakin. And honestly, Brett, it's a continuing conversation here on Word Balloon. The first half in particular, well, really, I would say up until the 90s, there are gaps in the 20th century history. And I think from the 90s moving forward, every fart has been logged by video. But really, in the case of your great uncle, people know the character Daredevil, and I'm sure are wise to at least that there was a Golden Age Daredevil prior to the Marvel Daredevil. They might know the name Lev Gleason. They certainly may know books like Crime Doesn't Pay, or Does Not Pay, I should say, to give it the proper title. But God, everything that happened to comic book publishers and creators from the 40s and the 50s, man, your uncle really suffered the greatest losses, and it's an incredible story, and I'm really glad you've documented it to the extent that you did, man. You did your detective work, and it shows, and really got to the bottom of this amazing, complex story.
Thank you. Thanks for saying that. I mean, it was, I love the way you put it, that recent comics history is very well documented in a level of granularity and detail that is kind of mind-blowing. And especially for someone like me, because I got to say right up front that I am not a comics expert by any means. I came to this story through the family connection, which is, that Lev Gleason was my mom's uncle. So I never met him. He died just a couple of years before I was born. But it was growing up and the stories that I heard from my mom about him, not so much about the comics, but about his personality, his larger than life, sort of flamboyant Manhattan personality that she was just in love with. And so kind of by osmosis, I started to fall in love with him. And, it wasn't until relatively later in life that I really started to drill down and get to the bottom of some of the sort of the mysteries of his life and career.
Really cool, man. And, yeah, you're right. And also, I didn't know that Gleason was not only a very active comic book publisher, but also active in political magazines and was a progressive of his time, using a modern phrase, a very liberal guy. And it is that liberalism that ultimately, I guess, put him under the microscope as far as the FBI and the House Un-American Activities people, the McCarthyism of that era, which, the more things change, the more they stay the same.
Isn't that right? One of the most amazing things about this project is that I started writing this book in the early 2000s. It took all these years and to get the book out, doing other stuff with my life, kind of moving along with my career and other things in life. All along the way, I was working on this book, and to your point, it just became more and more relevant as time went on, given the political situation in the US. But you're absolutely right. The reason I call the book American Daredevil Comics Communism and the Battles of Lev Gleason is really because I wanted to, I kind of, chose those words pretty carefully because obviously Daredevil, obvious connection, Daredevil, the golden age Daredevil was one of Uncle Lev's great creations, but also Lev himself was a daredevil if we see that as a risk taker, because he was really on the cutting edge, both on popular culture and politics. So popular culture, he was there at the birth of the comic book as we know it. He grew up in Boston, fought in France, dropped out of college to do so. And then when he got back, he moved right to New York City. He wanted to be where the action was. And he was part of that group of guys in New York City who really started out in advertising, but moved into this new medium called comic books and came up with a way to package advertising, but in a different way, and thereby allowing this whole new community of artists and writers to flourish in Manhattan. But at the same time, he was very active in, as you say, progressive politics, because at that time, we're talking about the mid to late 30s in New York City. This is right after the Depression. This is the New Deal. This is a time when people like Uncle Lev were coming to terms with, well, what is the proper role of government? Isn't government there to help people, try to lift people out of poverty? And isn't it the role of democracy to represent all voices and bring them together? And so he ran headlong into the reactionary forces that eventually started to fight back against some of those ideas, as you say, in the early kind of pre-McCarthy, but still the Red Scare that began right after World War II.
Yeah, and also with his politics, I'm always amazed that there is this handful of creatives from the 30s that were a part of comics and into the 40s that were kind of media stars of the time. And it's fun to think, because and obviously you're at least well aware that between the movies and the TV shows, how big superheroes and comic book creations are in current pop culture. But I'm a big fan of old radio and things like that. And it's like, there was an Adventures of Superman radio show that really was as big of a reason that Superman became immensely popular as the comic book and the comic strips. The Riverdale and the success of Riverdale. It's like, yeah, Archie was actually a popular sitcom for over a decade on radio. Right. Things like that. And also on these panel shows and chat shows, not only your uncle, but also Al Cap, the man who created Little Abner, was very much a public figure. And I guess in the case of your uncle, was it mostly in the New York area? Which again, this is back when New York really was the center of the culture
Media.
as far as
Yeah.
the United States goes.
Yeah, I mean, he was in his entire career was basically in New York City, in Manhattan on 32nd Street. That's where he created his office, and he functioned out of there both on the comic side and on the politics side. And so, they really came together, I would say, in the most obvious way in 1941 with the publication of Daredevil Battles Hitler, which there you go, this iconic cover where you see sort of the superhero imaginary battles of comics come right into conflict with the real battles that were happening in Europe at that time. And this was a period when folks like Uncle Lev were encouraging the U.S. to get involved in World War II. But there was great reluctance among American leadership, politicians, and Americans. I mean, we had fought in World War I. There wasn't this. We forget it now, but at the time there was a great sort of hesitancy to get involved. But Uncle Lev, by that time, had really embraced the idea that in order to defeat fascism in Europe and Nazism in Europe, the U.S. had to get involved, and so. He was doing a lot of anti-fascist activism during the 30s leading up to then, but then you see how it converges with the comic books, and Daredevil Battles Hitler was a way for him as a publisher. Remember, he's not the one writing these stories. He's not the one illustrating these stories. He's the one at the top putting together the teams of folks who would produce such amazing stuff. But he was directive. He did have a direction, and you can see how the political side kind of creeps into the comics through, for example, that cover.
Well, and also prior to starting his own company, it was pretty interesting to learn that he was part of, was it Eastern Colors, the publisher that put out Famous Funnies?
Yeah,
and really literally the first comic book where they just kind of took a chance with comic strips initially from the newspapers and created a magazine. And at first, as you can tell the story better, it was a giveaway, but they obviously saw the interest there and experimented with those first pre-Superman and Batman comic books and had great success. And this is about you tell me how many years it was before Action #1.
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting because Uncle Lev, we have to remember that comics didn't exist at the time. So it wasn't like Uncle Lev came to New York and said, I want to be a comic book publisher, because there was no such thing. My sense is that he wanted to make a name for himself. He wanted to be successful financially, but his great passion was politics and publishing. So the way he got his start was through advertising, and he started in Boston with a magazine called Open Road for Boys, which was a magazine that was for boys, but really when he got there was sort of targeted at parents. Like when you read these issues now from the early 30s, it was a time when the whole notion of appealing to kids and teenagers hadn't really emerged yet. And Uncle Lev, I think, was part of this new vanguard of folks that thought, look, we can speak directly to kids. We can speak directly to boys and probably do better. So he started that trend at Open Road for Boys, and then he moved to New York. And as you say, Eastern Color, he was an advertising man. That's basically where he started. And the goal was to find new ways to reach consumers. And so first, giving the funnies away for free, and then charging 10 cents. And people bought it, and kids bought it. And so there was this incredible realization that, wow, we can actually sell these and people will buy it. And then all of a sudden you had this incredible demand for content. So in some ways, similar to today, where content is really a driver, people are desperate for good content. Same thing back in the mid to late 30s in Manhattan. And, Uncle Lev really created a market for that.
I also love the fact that he's one of those guys that saw that Superman idea from Siegel and Schuster and said, "Nah, not interested."
Yeah,
And
he
believe me, I
passed
mean,
on it.
it's like the guys at Decca Records when the Beatles were presented
Right.
to them. Guitars are on the way out. No, we're not interested. Thanks.
Yeah, or all the publishers who passed on Harry Potter, and that was clearly the worst decision he ever made in his career. Live to regret it, but yeah, he, on the other hand, he was, I think, we've talked about Daredevil, but the other great success he had, perhaps even a bigger financial success, was Crime Does Not Pay. And this came about towards the end of World War II. And when I think that Uncle Lev recognized that superheroes had been incredibly successful by this time, as you say, Superman, Daredevil, others. But Uncle Lev sensed that in this post-war period, that people would continue to buy superhero comics, but there was going to be an appetite for something different. And so Crime Does Not Pay, which already existed, that name came from an MGM series, as you would say, like multiple media being successful at the time. So the idea was to take real life criminals and their stories and put them in the pages of comic books. And wow, that really tapped into something. And it tapped into not just the children and teenage market, but adult readership as well. And when Uncle Lev ran into trouble with the anti-comics folks, Dr. Wortham, obviously, but even beforehand, one of his rebuttals was always, well, look, it's not just kids who are reading my comics. So let's not limit this medium to children, because there are a lot of adults reading it. And I think Crime Does Not Pay was particularly attractive to an adult readership.
Yeah, and also, again, you really not only give us the facts, but really provide the atmosphere, what life was like at that moment. I think you do a great job of that. And as we get into this post-war period where the scrutiny of comics start to, becomes more apparent with Dr. Wortham and the seduction of the innocent. But even before that, as you point out in your book, and again, this is why I love this book, because I certainly learned a lot, and I consider myself an amateur historian trying to find out as much as I can about the history of comics. But it's great to see, and I was trying to find it on my I bought the Kindle. You were kind of sending me the book, but I also want to support you, so I bought the book as well.
Thank you.
And that one, those 2 pages where during the Wortham scare and the hearings about juvenile delinquency in comics, that the publishers reached out to their readers to kind of say, hey, would you explain to these people that you read comics and you're not a juvenile delinquent? And you've got great examples of real letters, both from children and adults. And there's one of a 27-year-old man. My wife and I love reading comics. We're not criminals. We're not deviants. I mean, it's great. And also the ones from the teenagers as well. Very well written. And just like, relax. Okay. It's entertainment.
Absolutely.
Life gets stressful, and these are like a nice way to relax. And any person reading this can relate, a modern comic book fan or even streaming fans. And that's the thing, man. It was just, it was this crazy, crazy time. But also, as you point out, that group of teenagers, and I've seen David Halberstam make the same point in his amazing book, The 50s, that it was that generation of teenagers that finally had pocket money of their own. Mm-hmm. They were becoming consumers. All of a sudden, people that made products and advertisers recognized the youth culture as being a potential audience to sell stuff to. And finally, with after school jobs and the like, suddenly they had money. And they, they wanted to spend it, and they spent it on rock and roll records, and they spend it on comics.
Mm-hmm. And I think that was scary for a lot of people, for parents, for certain politicians, for the church. There were groups in American society who didn't embrace that phenomenon, but rather resisted it. And I think Uncle Lev was on the early side of embracing it, and not for selfless reasons, but because he knew that there was money to be made from appealing to young people directly. And he became, the interesting thing about Uncle Lev is that he wasn't just resisting privately. He was very publicly resisting this censorship effort. And again, before Fred Wortham came along, Uncle Lev became the president of the Association of Comic Magazine Publishers. And before what we know of as the Comics Code came along, there was an earlier effort that Uncle Lev basically led, which was to bring together comic book publishers and stave off censorship by the government by creating a code and a sort of set of guidelines that would allow the publishers to basically publish what they wanted to and appeal to the consumers they were trying to reach, but stave off the threat of censorship. And it worked. It worked for a while. And as you say, he was very active. He was on radio. And then when TV came along, because remember, there was no TV when he started, but when TV came along, he was right on there. He was debating Senator Kefauver. He was debating Fred Wortham on behalf of the industry. And, you know, I will say he wasn't always completely consistent with the arguments he made. You know, he would use whichever argument was most convenient for the time. So, for example, we've talked about how he would say, well, look, it's not just kids who are reading comics, it's adults too. So don't narrow it in. But on the other hand, he would say, well, comics help kids learn to read. And comics help kids learn that crime is actually a problem. After all, it's called Crime Does Not Pay. But I think at the end of the day, the argument that he found most effective was this again, the argument of freedom. It's like, look, this is America, and the government is not to tell us what we can and cannot read. You know, and even take into account concerns about children if you have them and their vulnerability. Look, we need to allow people to find and consume the information and culture that appeals to them. And that is how we succeed as a free society. So I think he really believed in that. And again, it's a way in which the politics and the comics come together, because he was a strong proponent of a free and open democratic society.
If we go back to some of these original comics, this is Silver Streak Comics technically is the title, but obviously you see Daredevil battling the Claw. Now, was this his debut? This is issue 7.
I think it's 6 or 7, Silver Streak, first time you see Daredevil. But it wasn't until that Daredevil battles Hitler that I think Daredevil was sort of top billing. Which was kind of a year later, I think.
Understood. And yeah, he really became the flagship character for Lev Gleason Publications. And God, here's a great World War II image. Yeah. I love that. And that's the thing, man. I mean, this Daredevil, for people who don't know, the Golden Age Daredevil, he, much like Bruce Wayne, his parents were killed, although they were killed by, I believe, Nazis, and it traumatized him.
Yes.
And he was
rendered him mute. That's right. He was so traumatized, it rendered him mute.
But he had his, as you can see from the images, he had his boomerang. That was his weapon. And his gold spiked belt.
Yeah.
But a great character. And then also, we mentioned Crime Does Not Pay, but then there was also Crime Buster.
Mm-hmm.
And Crime Buster was this great teenage hero that came later. And, was another important and successful character, and I guess in the pages of Boy Comics.
Yeah, and his sidekick Squeaks the monkey, who appears on his shoulder there. And I have a great photo of so Uncle Lev, again, he was a publisher. His genius, I think, in the world of comics was finding the right people, recognizing talent, and bringing them together, and then giving them the power, independence, and authority to make great comics. And he basically found Charlie Biro and Bob Wood. So it's a Woodrow, they were known as together, editorial team. And they were the ones who came up with many of these great characters. And I have a great photo of Uncle Lev sort of peering over Charlie Biro's shoulder in the office, and perched on Charlie Biro's shoulder is a monkey. So there was an actual Squeaks the monkey who was scampering around their office on East 32nd Street. And there these, I think that the Boy Comics and Crime Buster that's an interesting sort of take on the superhero, because Charlie Biro in particular, he shared Uncle Lev's politics, very progressive, very interested in social issues. And so a lot of these stories focused around the fight of good against evil, but in pretty commonplace everyday situations that might face kids who were challenged by situations where it's like, wait, what is the right thing to do here? What is the honest thing to do here? How can I help people? How can I raise up the downtrodden? How can I elevate those folks in our society who are not as lucky as some of us? And you see that those themes kind of coursing through Crime Buster, Boy Comics in particular. Then there's the Little Wise Guys, who are sort of a band of kids who showed up, and it's like Daredevil and the Little Wise Guys. Again, I think that was a way to sort of connect to young readers, but also the messages, the lessons are pretty explicit in a lot of these comic books. And I think that has a lot to do with Charlie Biro and his belief in his version of morality, and how society should be structured, and really a focus on the underdog.
The Little Wise Guys kind of took over the book, as evidenced by that cover, because even though Daredevil's there in the name, you don't see him on the cover there at all. And it's kind of part of that shift from the post-war years, that as much as they tried to stay with the superheroes, the interest did kind of wane. And so, even it's funny, Wood and Biro are essentially the Simon Kirby of your uncle's company and everything.
Yep.
And just like them, first creating Captain America and the superheroes they created, they moved on, and they had Boys Ranch and the Boy Commandos. And so they had the boy gang groups. And then, of course, in the 50s, they did romance comics, and I know your uncle did as well. Yeah. So, they continued in other genres. And again, it is kind of that period before the mid-50s, after the Wortham Scare, when DC reintroduced a new Flash and the Silver Age characters started to emerge, the new Green Lantern and the like. There was this period post-war where a lot of the other genres were really taking over. And in fact, you even say beyond your uncle's company that really after the dust cleared from that Wortham and Kefauver investigative period, that really Dell Comics was winning with their funny books and their books about the Disney characters and stuff like that.
Because in that, so the Comics Code that eventually, as we said, there was the first iteration that didn't really work so well because most publishers didn't really participate, and that effort kind of waned. And then there was a new effort, and that did take hold. But as a result, publishers like Lev Gleason Publications basically couldn't survive because you take a look at this cover here of Crime Does Not Pay. I mean, almost every aspect of this cover would be unacceptable under the code. And Uncle Lev fought against a lot of very specific provisions, like this provision. I think it even got as specific as like how the word crime could appear. The word crime couldn't be bigger than other. I mean, these were clearly targeted at Crime Does Not Pay and other crime, and not to mention horror comics, which Uncle Lev never got into horror comics, and he liked to think of crime comics as very distinct from and perhaps more elevated than horror comics. But let's be honest, the Comics Code was designed to weed out those titles and favor titles, as you say, like Disney and Dell, and that's what happened. So by 1956, Lev Gleason Publications was dissolved and out of business, and that was that.
Yeah, and it's funny because, again, I think people who do know about that seduction of the innocent era, they know about EC Comics and they know about Bill Gaines, and God, it's amazing. And maybe in your research, you unearthed that WNEW broadcast of the comic hearings, and you even hear Bill Gaines kind of on there. Did Lev appear before that committee as well?
Oh, it's such an amazing thing. He did not appear before that committee, and so in the book, I write about how I wondered why, because he was so active, he was so public, and as it turns out, he tried to appear and he desperately wanted to appear, and so in the files of the committee, which had hearings in D.C. but also had hearings in New York City. At the Roosevelt Hotel right near Grand Central, Midtown Manhattan. In the files, I found correspondence between Uncle Lev and the chair of the committee and the counsel to the committee saying, I would like to appear. There are publishers like me who are not like Gaines. We're different, as I was saying before, trying to distinguish himself from the horror genre. But he was not invited to appear. And he eventually kind of lashed out, not publicly, but privately, and gave a hint of what he might have done with respect to Dr. Wortham, as I found a letter in which he makes some claims about Dr. Wortham being dishonest, having a personal life that wasn't exactly squeaky clean. And, that never came out. And Uncle Lev, I think by that time you find that he is on the wane in terms of his influence in the industry and his desire, to be honest, to remain engaged in the fight. And so it's not until decades later in recent research, that Professor Tilley and others have done with respect to Wortham, where we see that, a lot of the research that he based his book upon was actually flawed. The studies he conducted not very rigorous, which resulted in some of his really outlandish claims about comics just destroying kids' lives. So I think that's another example of how Uncle Lev was a little bit ahead of the curve, but the industry wasn't really ready, I think, at that time to attack Dr. Wortham personally like that. But Uncle Lev, if he had been given a platform, he might well have done so.
It's interesting, too, that unlike Gaines, who then just took his material and created Mad Magazine, and as a slick magazine, was no longer, bound by the Comics Code Authority. It could really continue to tell the stories that he wanted to tell. It is disappointing that Lev didn't continue, but as you say, given the other circumstances of his life, he clearly was kind of burnt out from I think his business experiences in, I'm assuming, both the magazine and comic book business.
Yeah, I think that's true. It's one of the most frustrating things about writing a book about someone who's passed away is that you can't just ask them, what were you thinking? What was going through your mind? But I think you're right that by that time, not just because of the comics, but because of what he had experienced due to his politics and having been really attacked in the press throughout the 40s. I mean, really, it's amazing. I was just blown away by how much coverage was given to Uncle Lev's politics in the New York Times, in Newsweek magazine. He really was a public figure. He was mentioned on Walter Winchell's radio show, which was this nightly show that had a huge listenership, and it all had to do with this accusation that he was a communist and that he was a traitor and that he was treasonous, and all of that from my perspective, is, preposterous, because he was a very patriotic American who fought in World War I and then served again in World War II, and he deeply loved his country. But as we know, at that time, if there was a hint that you supported the Communist Party, either directly or through what was known as a front organization, then you were immediately branded un-American, and committed to the overthrow of the United States government, which is so ironic because Uncle Lev loved FDR. He loved Harry Truman. He was basically a New Deal Democrat. And, by today's standards, really pretty run of the mill, middle of the road, moderate Democrat. But at that time, it was, the context was just so polarized, and the Red Scare, even before McCarthy came along, the Red Scare was in full force. And the fact that Uncle Lev had been involved in progressive politics, and he certainly was involved with communists in New York City in the 1930s, because it would have been hard not to be if you were involved in politics and hanging out with artists and writers and activists. But later, after the war, that became a real liability for him.
Yeah, and I mean that is the thing. And good Lord, as we mentioned, the New Deal, there were several in Roosevelt's own administration that were labeled communists, and of course, even a guy like George Marshall, who was so important to both Roosevelt and Truman, and the reconstruction of Europe after World War II. And an asshole like Joe McCarthy has the nerve in the testimony with Marshall, "You're not fit to wear that uniform." And it's like, this guy truly was like such a great American patriot.
Right.
And again,
yeah.
But that was the temperature of the room back then. And everybody was scared, and they couldn't even accept the idea of discussion of different ideas. And you mentioned the circles that your uncle was in back in the 30s. Name some of those like celebrities that he was friends with back then.
Yeah, I mean, he was very close to writers like Dashiell Hammett, who wrote The Maltese Falcon, his wife Lillian Hellman, who was a playwright. But he was also involved with some really high-profile Hollywood types like Lucille Ball, artists like Pablo Picasso, Paul Robeson, the incredible singer and civil rights activist. These folks were hanging out together, and they were involved in similar efforts like the organization that really caused a lot of problems for Uncle Lev, which was this nonprofit called the Joint Anti-Fascist Refugee Committee, which was an organization that was founded in New York to support refugees who were fleeing Spain because of the Franco regime that was coming to power, and the fighting against the regime that was basically at the heart of the Spanish Civil War. So it's interesting because Uncle Lev, he didn't fight in the Spanish Civil War. That was one of there were so many rumors that I had to kind of investigate or debunk, and one of them was that Uncle Lev had fought in Spain as part of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade against Franco. That's not the case, but he was working in New York, raising money, and so he became a board member of this group. And Pablo Picasso, being Spanish, was a very active spokesperson on behalf of this cause. But to what we were talking about before, very quickly the anti-communist forces in Washington branded this group a communist front, because indeed there were communists in Spain who were fighting against Franco.
Yep.
So the thing is, there's always a kernel of truth. There's always a connection, and so it's not that this group was completely free of communist influence. It's just that what the argument that was made, that was ultimately disproven, that this organization was somehow a front for the Communist Party and was trying to, again, overthrow the US government in the name of Soviet communism, was just just so far from the truth. I mean, this was basically a nonprofit with folks like Lucille Ball trying to raise money for poor refugees who didn't have a place to live.
Yeah.
So it's really, pretty straightforward.
Yeah, and again, those celebrities that you mentioned and people that only know the reruns of I Love Lucy may not realize that, but yeah, very much a portion of her life, Lucille Ball was being accused of being a communist, and Humphrey Bogart, and God, there's that amazing First Amendment radio special that Lucille Ball participates in, and Humphrey Bogart and Katharine Hepburn, and it's all this like wave that the Hollywood 10, the screenwriters were also part of this group as well, trying to fight against this. But that McCarthyism wave and the group that was running the Un-American Activities Committee prior to McCarthy, no, they were just too strong, and they ruined a lot of careers. And it's amazing the various people that survived that scrutiny. And then you yourself, like after Lev leaves publishing in '56, you're not really sure what happened to him, and you had to like go to the FBI. And this is another. I don't mean to spoil your book, Brett, I swear, but it is fascinating, and I'll let people know for themselves. But, you went and got a Freedom of Information Act request about your uncle and discovered there is an FBI file on your uncle, a pretty big one.
Yes, it's so interesting when you're doing research, and this, you're looking for anything, any sort of shred of information here and there. And I thought, well, I may as well see what the FBI has to say. And so I sent in this request. Lo and behold, they sent me back, a 200-page dossier devoted exclusively to Uncle Lev. And it was filled with redactions, remember, it's kind of like the Nixon tapes with everything sort of blacked out. Well, there's, the FBI today is still redacting information. And each redaction has a little footnote next to it, so it's sort of categorized, and most of them were to protect sources. So when an FBI file says so and so told us such and such, they'll black out the so and so because they want to protect the identity of their informants. It's that the FBI followed Uncle Lev for years and years, even rifling through his trash outside his house in Westchester, because he worked in Manhattan, but he lived in the suburbs, reading his mail. The agents would sort of show up at meetings that Uncle Lev was participating in and kind of lurk in the parking lot and take down license plate numbers and observe who's coming and going. I mean, really enormous amounts of resources. If you imagine, like, just from the perspective of a taxpayer, imagine the resources that the FBI devoted to following folks who were just couldn't possibly represent a threat to the government of the United States. And yet they were determined to find something. I won't, as I say, I won't reveal everything that's in the FBI file, but it was amazing how a lot of what was in there, by the time I got the FBI file, I had already figured out on my own. Because the FBI was relying on the media for a lot of the information that it used. There was this interesting relationship between the conservative anti-communist media and the FBI at the time. And I always thought of the relationship between the Department of Justice and the media as, the Justice Department would from time to time leak information to the media to frame a story in a certain way. But what I found was that actually the media fed a lot of information to the FBI, which they used as the basis for a lot of these investigations. And the media, as we know, is not always the most reliable source. And so a lot of the stuff in there was just kind of rumor, I would say, not fact.
Well, and again, or guilt by association, and it's you'd put it in more modern terms, 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon. If Kevin Bacon were a communist, exactly, what's the connection? Yeah, it's crazy, man. And again, it's such a great read, and you really do provide not just the facts, but again, the environment in which Lev was dealing with all this stuff, and you really bring to life, I think, New York of all of these decades that you cover. And also New England as well. And as a contrast, your initial contact about your uncle was obviously through your mom, who was Lev's niece, and like you said, he was like a hero to her in terms of what a glamorous New York life that Uncle Lev is leading, while you guys are out, or while she's off in New England and enjoying her New England life and everything. I think, it's crazy. I'll even reveal this if you feel like, any sort of connection. I have an uncle who was a doctor in Chicago, and on the surface was a high society doctor, was in all the society pages. It turned out he was a back alley abortionist for the mob. Oh, and and I mean, literally, like our family would have photo albums and these beautiful black and white pictures of Uncle Bill. It's like, who's that? And they're like, oh, that's Uncle Bill. We don't talk about Uncle Bill. and all of a sudden, Sam Giancana's daughter writes her memoirs, Antoinette, Tony Giancana, and apparently she had an abortion, and my uncle performed the abortion. And when Sam found out, they chased him to Arizona, and they killed him. And he was buried in the Arizona desert. Crazy story. And one day, much as I don't know how you started to discover this past of your uncle's, but it was covered in the Chicago Tribune Sunday magazine. And my sister calls me up. It's like, hey, remember Uncle Bill that we don't talk about? I'm like, yeah. She's like, check out the Sunday paper. And it's like, oh my God. So, and I don't mean to smile, because obviously this guy was a monster. Unlike your uncle was at least trying to do the right thing and be a good spokesman for what we all believe in terms of, hey, and thank God we're dealing with an administration now that really does recognize, hey, the government can actually work against big business and some of the powers that keep the underprivileged down, and they can do a difference. And not since Lyndon Johnson and before his problems with Vietnam, what he tried to do with the Great Society in the 60s, this is really the first next effort. I mean, they compare it to the New Deal and the Great Society and what Biden's trying to do. But at least, unfortunately, because things have gotten so bad, it's like maybe the government should help and correct some of these things and make it a little easier for people to just lead a decent life. Yeah, no, absolutely. And I absolutely agree. And Uncle Lev would agree 100% too. He kind of retreated from public life, as we talked about, in the mid-50s. He moves away. He leaves all of this behind. But he did remain very politically engaged. And one of my favorite discoveries was his entry in the 50th anniversary report of his college class. And if he had stuck around, he would have graduated from Harvard in the class of 1920. So in 1970, they published this kind of 50th anniversary book. And in this book, you've got a lot of summaries by his classmates of all the wonderful things they've accomplished and how much money they've made and how they're spending their time sort of playing golf and enjoying the fruits of their labor. But Uncle Lev, he actually devotes his final comment, because he would pass away the next year, to the fight against the war in Vietnam and the civil rights movement. And he's very, very explicit that he's against the war in Vietnam and he's for civil rights. And his hope lies with the young people of that time. We're talking 1970. And while he at that time he wasn't out marching because he was older. Some of the reasons we've talked about made him a little shy to be in public any longer, but he was solidly supporting the young people. And I think that he would, if he were around today, he would feel very hopeful given what we're seeing, and especially the results of the most recent election. He would have been euphoric. Understood. Now, sometimes things have to get really dark before light makes sense, and we find our way again. But that's right. I got to ask you, as we're wrapping up, because these characters were so distinct. Are they all in public domain? Is Crime Buster? I know Daredevil is the Golden Age Daredevil, but is Crime Buster also and these other creations that he had?
Yeah. It's incredible to me. I don't think this would happen today, but in 1955, 1956, when Uncle Lev was closing up shop and Lev Gleason Publications dissolved, he really made no effort to protect these characters. They all fell into the public domain. And so obviously we saw Daredevil was picked up again, and the Daredevil that most people are familiar with today is not the Golden Age Daredevil, but the one that came along later. But yes, all of these characters in the public domain, and some publishers have created new stories based on them, including the publisher of my book, Chapter House, which, I'm not involved in this at all, except that they're my publisher. But Chapter House is publishing new stories with characters like Silver Streak and Captain Battle. Those are the ones they're focused on right now. But yeah, modern day stories, they are very interested in the story of Uncle Lev because they're interested not only in the comics, but also the progressive politics. So these new stories are really designed to relaunch these characters, but with a modern sensibility and progressive values. So yeah, it's pretty cool. We'll see what comes of it, but there's a lot of opportunity, I think, to resuscitate these characters and give them new life.
Absolutely. I know Eric Larson too had the Golden Age Daredevil within the last 10 years show up in Savage Dragon, and that was pretty cool. And in fact, you even tell the story that Pete Morisi wanted to get the rights to Daredevil, and Charlie Biro, unfortunately, kind of blocked that or wanted participation.
He wanted
so
a
instead,
cut, basically.
What's that?
He wanted a cut, I think.
Right, yeah. When I say participation, let's get down to brass tacks. He wanted money. And that's fair, because he had a big part in creating the character. But instead, Pete ended up creating Thunderbolt and used that red and blue Daredevil costume, I think, as a template. But then, Peter Cannon Thunderbolt looked a bit different, and it became its own thing. But I think it's interesting, and I would really love to see not only, as you mentioned, Captain Battle and Silver Streak, but I would love to see new Crime Buster stories. I think Crime Buster would be really interesting to reboot, and maybe a legacy character and the father remembering his adventures, and now a new teenage hero dealing with today's world and trying to make a difference. But yeah, they're great characters, and it is a shame that they did lapse in the public domain, and your uncle rather didn't see the value in hanging on to them. But you're right, that would never happen today. Nobody lets go of an IP, as ridiculous as it may be or small as it may be. It's like somebody could make the right story and make this thing an overnight success again. So yeah, I hear you, man.
Yeah, it's a different world. It really is. It really is.
Absolutely. Well, listen, we can wrap up, and I will say again, this is the book, American Daredevil, Comics Communism, and the Battles of Lev Gleason. And Brett Dakin is the author. Brett, thank you for talking. It's from Chapel House. That's the publisher.
Chapter House, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Pardon me?
Chapter House, like the chapters in a book.
Excuse me. Yes. Yeah. And it's you can get it now. You can order the hard copy, or you can order the Kindle, or through your local bookstores as well. Our comic shops, I'm sure comic shops are picking this up as well. It is an excellent read. It really explains a lot of that 40s and 50s, and then even really starting in the 30s comics history. And I'm really glad you did this, Brett, because beyond finding out about your uncle, you're really solving a lot of mysteries and making aware of not just the stories we already know, but a whole bunch of other stories connected to this very weird period of the golden age of comics. So I thank you for making it. Congratulations on the book, and I appreciate you talking to me today.
Oh, thank you so much, Sean. This has been great. I really appreciate it as well.
There you go. Everybody, later on tonight at it'll be 12:30 Eastern. Brett will be asleep by then. But for my West Coast audience, starting at 9:30 Pacific time, it's going to be another episode of To the Outer Limits. Gabe Hardman and myself will be examining the second episode of Season 2 of the original Outer Limits, featuring William Shatner, Cold Hands, Warm Heart. a pretty fun, crazy sci-fi story of an astronaut coming back from Venus with a lot of problems. But we'll be discussing that later on tonight. And until then, I thank you for watching, and stay safe, stay happy, and stay healthy. Thanks.